In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Santiago's C. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is an incredibly dark blue, almost to the point of thinking maybe it's black, maybe. There's no tone variation of this ink by pen and no shading at all. That is, there are times it may look to get a bit darker, but what you're seeing is a kind of red sheen, making it appear a bit darker. And in a wetter broad pen, almost appears to be a super dark purple. Now, I don't tend to run towards sheening inks, but this does look very nice on the page, and it does have that ability to pass in a professional environment where you might need a black. Probably would go unnoticed. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Waterman Graduate with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, you can see just how dark this is really writing. I assure you it is still a very dark blue. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. There's a few moments where you do see some sheen coming through on this paper. There's no shade whatsoever. This, again, it has that, it's so dark, it's almost black, but it's really a super dark purple we're seeing a lot. Definitely still blue. Weird. Looking at the broad nib, it is appearing much darker than it did in the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not shading. It is sheening, and it is sheening a lot, which is what's making it appear so much darker. So while it's not really going to show up on camera because it's really a fixed side that you're seeing, trust me in that it's there. Looking at the stub, that was it, stub nib. We see it is just a tad bit darker than what we were getting in the broad. Just a tad. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. That tad bit darker is the little bit more sheen is showing up. And when I am here in the after, holding it at the light, it almost consistently sheens the whole way. Looking at the back of the page, I'm pointing to a couple of spots where it did get deeper into the page. Nothing came through and touched the page underneath, and the ghosting, I think, is well under control. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Kaweco Sport with a medium nib, a Kaweco Sport with a broad nib, a Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we did with the Clairfontaine paper. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, it's not sheening. Now, what's happening is the absorbent nature of the paper is making the sheen really go away, which is something very common when you deal with non-fountain pen paper. So it's nothing bad for this ink. Looking at the broad nib, it does look quite a bit darker than we had with the medium on here, about the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, and a lot, big, constantly, there forever, a woolly beast of feathering when a woolly beast is covered with feathers. Forget that analogy. It's not shading, it's not sheening. The sheen is absorbed by the paper. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It does feather like a feathery beast. Fixed it this time, you feathery monster. It does have a tiny bit of spread. It does not have any kind of shading. It does not have the sheen coming through. That kind of performance is really reserved for the fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is very much an issue with this ink on this paper, though none of this came through and touched the pages underneath. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker, I think, than what we saw on the Clairfontaine. We don't get any kind of major feathering like the last one. We get minor feathering, really manageable feathering here. The same with the spread. It does spread just a little bit, but completely manageable considering the paper. The tone of the paper isn't doing a lot to the color. I think why it's so much darker is the absorbent nature. Now, we're not getting any kind of shading, wouldn't expect it. Looking at the broad nib, much darker than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine and the last paper. Very opaque ink here, not really affected, I think, by the tone, but by the absorbency here. It does feather quite a bit, a lot, kind of like on the last paper. It does spread, and more than I would prefer. Both the feather and spread would stop me from wanting to use this on this paper. It doesn't shade or sheen. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We still get feather. We still get spread. Oh, you feathery little monster. Join your crew on Sesame Street. It doesn't shade. It doesn't sheen. It really looks like a super dark purple, though, much more than a kind of black. Very interesting in what I'm seeing. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is an issue. You can't write back here, but none of this came through and touched the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get similar, just a little bit lighter than the last paper as a tone, just a little bit darker, a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any kind of feathering, we're not getting any kind of spread, not getting any kind of shading, not getting any kind of sheen. What we're getting is looks black, not dark purple, looks black. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than what we had with the medium. Funny, because the medium looked black, this looks super dark purple. We're not getting any feathering, not getting any kind of spread. Really enjoy this paper. If I haven't said it enough over this past year, we're not getting any kind of shading. The sheen itself is not coming through. It's kind of a letdown in that I know it's there a lot. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. Now, it does feather a little bit. You see it in university, especially look at the T. We see it in butt. Look at the B and the T. Not my butt, butt on the page. Not my butt on the page. That's not on camera. Its spread is not happening. It's not shading. It's not showing the sheen. It is a little bit disappointing here, only because I know what this ink can do. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does ghost quite a bit. I think you could write on it with the medium, not so much with the broad or the stub. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman's number 8. Here is Diamine Kensington Blue. Here is Diamine Majestic Blue. Here is Pilot Asiatic Dayflower. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same dark tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading or sheening. I'm holding it to the light at some angle, and I wish I could see some of the sheen coming through because this paper has done so remarkably well. I mean, I think how well this paper is done over this year, and I think Office Depot should be making a call to me because I think this is going to do well. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we got with the medium, about the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. You're going to see it on the third line of theoretical, the fourth line addition. Second line, well, off on the right, tiny feathers. It's not spreading, not shading, not sheening. I take that back because I'm tilting it right now and looking towards the light, and I am seeing a little bit of sheen coming through on this paper. Wow. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We do still get a tiny bit of feathering that's going on. You'll see it on the bottom of the R in librarian. You'll see it on the A of practically, on the second line. Not a ton where it shows up, only a couple of spots, and I've probably pointed them all out. Don't forget to look at terrible state at the very end. It's not spreading, it's not shading, it is sheening some. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is fairly well under control. You see the writing, but I think you could easily write on the back of this page, nothing bled through, and touch the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Zenzoy, they're pink. Here is an orange ink by Robert Oster, they're NG Special. Here is a magenta ink by Private Reserve, they're Burgundy Mist. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis, they're Emma Goldman or Gold. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. Tad bit lighter, but about the same. Just a little lighter. We do get a tiny little bit of feather. We do get a tiny little bit of spread. We do not get shade. We do not get sheen. We are seeing a fairly good representation on this paper in that I think you could use it and it wouldn't be the end of the world. Just be aware that you're writing on 20-pound copy paper, which means things aren't perfect. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium. It is a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. I see a little more of the purple from the sheen that is not going to be happening here, but it's having an effect on the color as I'm seeing it. Don't know if it's going to come through on camera. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It's not shading, not sheening, but whatever causes the sheen is giving a little purple look. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad, meaning it's got that little bit of purple lean to it from whatever causes that sheen, even though the sheen is not here. Does it feather? Yes, a little bit. Does it spread? Yes, a little bit. Does it shade? No, not even a little bit. And it doesn't sheen either. It's just there as an interesting color. Looking at the page underneath, you see that it did bleed through and touch that page quite a bit of times. And when you see the back of the page, it's obvious why, with all of this extreme ghosting and deep into the paper that the ink has done. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? For the color, it is really a dealer's choice for pens, no doubt. But if you want the sheen, go for a wet, medium, or larger nib. You'll get it, and it's going to be worth it. You won't be disappointed in what you're getting. It does it very well, and I don't know if my setup has improved enough to really be able to see it, but my location hasn't changed over the years of doing these videos. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.